Greetings and Aquaba. Welcome yet again to another live broadcast of I Speaks, building new legacy, speaking of prosperity and all of the other things that keep us uplifted and empowered. This is your host, Queen Mother Dr. Chin Zero. And it's been a moment, and life beyond lifing has given us an opportunity to give thanks and praise every single time. So if you are not in the best space right now, if you are shifting between your prosperity role and you're feeling any kind of other than positive vibration, we are encouraging each and every one of you that are viewing or within earshot to speak truth, not to power, but speak truth as power. And we're going to start a little differently than we have in the past. We'd like to give thanks and praise to the one most high. We'd like to live each day daily for the one most divine, and we are to do it tomorrow just as we do it today. Amen. Hallelujah. Duan Ter, Asheo, all of these terms, giving thanks, giving thanks. So tonight's broadcast will have a slightly different flavor. For those that are familiar with that prayer, and are used to me singing it, sharing it in a space that's a tad more rhythmical in an ancient Ankh legacy language of the Meta Nature, the words of divine or the words of nature, the words through the creative source. Amasu and Fanter, Sauksu, Emifran Fanter, Aura, Maketi Paheruda. Same term. We're giving thanks and praise. We're honoring infinite source, because through that manifestation, we're able to be prosperous. We are able to be prosperous in health, wellness, resources, relations being smoother than customary. And we're always engaging with one another in a space of love, joy, tranquility, balance, and harmony. Even if there are distractions on the global frame of our lives that look chaotic, disheveled, hostile, unpleasant. Our intention is to draw from our own source power and to ask for the creative, infinite source to really sit deep in our body, mind, soul, spirit, and consciousness, in our hearts, in the center of our spirit, to give us that little extra, a little extra that is so essential in these times. Part of what I'd like to offer this evening, as well as we are moving forward with the Crew Podcasts and Media Networks, bringing different perspectives, different ideas, different actionable deliverables inside of all of our various pieces. I realize that there are a number of opportunities that we tend to overlook sometimes. And sometimes, sometimes we forget to remember sacred source. And sometimes we overlook different things that would give us the balance in so many different ways. And I share this for a number of reasons, because when we speak of how do we utilize our broadcast, how do we engage with our resources, how do we make sure that we're able to have truth, justice, order, reciprocity, balance, divine righteousness, and harmony hold up in our daily lives, in the lives that we impact, those of our family, our friends, our coworkers, our comrades. And how do we bring this vibration of efficiency, this vibration of Love, not just love like the mushy, what the word love looks like, but the action driven, nurturing, cultivated, respectful, principled, really nurturing love. Some refer to it as agape love in select scripture. Some refer to it as mer, M-E-R with a rolled R. And it's not just a love of something temporary. And sometimes it is conditional, not always unconditional. There's there's a relationship exchange when someone says, I care for you and I love your spirit. I love your essence. I love your soul. It's very different than just I love you, or that the love is only based on the money you have, the resources you bring to a table. Not that they aren't important, but love is a, to be grounded in a space that facilitates all the areas of prosperity, ancestral sacred traditions, ancient techniques and strategies for how we begin to respect what people like to, in a simplistic form. You know, when we hear that term Ubuntu, just the sound, Ubuntu, in a very basic translation to English, that term Ubuntu, I respect and honor the divinity in you as you respect and honor the divinity in me. For some, I am because you are because I am. And if we go really back into what persons are sometimes more familiar with in select scripture, biblical texts, I am that I am. That may sound more familiar and resonate for many. So I offer that in the context of some of the discussions, some of the ideas, some of the wonderful pieces of information that I'd like to share. And I'd like to start from a space where in the Virgin Islands, and for those that aren't familiar, the Virgin Islands is 90 miles south of Puerto Rico. There is a 40-mile space between the Isle of St. Thomas, where Charlotte Amalie is the capital. South is St. Croix. Slightly north is St. John, and across beyond Whistler's Key in the Caribbean Sea is the British Virgin Islands, and you can continue moving around from there. But just keep in mind, we're close to Puerto Rico. You know, most people remember Puerto Rico, and we're not Jamaica, we're further south. And I just like to give context of where we are. And in the Virgin Islands, which is a non incorporated, non self governing territory of the United States of America, so yes, you do not need a passport, but effective May 2025, you do have to have some form of a real ID or government issued identification to at least come. But you're not going through a visa immigration process because this is still part of the United States in that regard since 1917. Actually, the purchase and the transfer of the $25 million dollars in gold happened August 1916, but the actual ceremonial transfer from the Danish flag to the US flag and so forth, known as Transfer Day, happened on March 31st, 1917. So we're speaking over 100 years, 108 to be exact, just so we get context of what we're speaking of in this American territorial space. And one of the things that has been happening in the Virgin Islands is, unlike other states and even commonwealths like Puerto Rico, that has a very different relationship with the US, but is still part of the US in many in given specifics. And there is they have a constitution that governs their activities, their policies, their respective laws. particular to Puerto Rico, while the US Constitution, of course, is the sovereign governing constitution, but at least like other states in the 48 contiguous US, Puerto Rico has their own constitution. We recognize that similar to DC, District of Columbia, which does not operate as a state, even though it's where the capital sits, the Virgin Islands of the United States does not have a constitution yet. And this year, based on the outcome of elections for delegates for the sixth Constitution Convention, I want to highlight that the sixth Constitution Convention, going, far back into the 80s and 70s, where it was directed by the Department of the Interior, by the federal government, that the Virgin Islands community were to be engaged in public awareness, public education, to establish a constitution for the Virgin Islands, which has not happened yet. Currently, we have our sixth Constitution Convention delegates, and they have a timeline that is coming very short to establish a constitution that is, of course, reviewed by the people of the Virgin Islands. However, it has to be properly vetted and approved by the executive branch of government here in the Virgin Islands, along with, even when it goes through that process, there's yet another process for it to be approved through the government of the government of the United States. So I'm going to leave that part there because I encourage persons that would like to know anything about the Constitution Convention in the Virgin Islands, because some persons probably do not even realize that the Virgin Islands is part of the United States. There is another portion of the Virgin Islands which is within the what they call the British Virgin Islands, and that's a little different because they are moving in the direction of having their autonomous space and having more BVI rights, having indigenous ancestral rights for the people, the lands, the resources in the British Virgin Islands, which, again, obviously by the name, had been under British governance. And they do have constitution. They do have ancestral native rights for Virgin Islanders born there, or the children and or grandchildren of persons born there. So there's a much different engagement. And they have their own form of governance that allows for them to have more autonomy. And why would I mention these things? Because we just finished earlier in the month of July talking about independence in the 48 contiguous US, emancipation, July 3rd on the Virgin Islands, US. August 1st is an emancipation major celebration for former British colonies, which are primarily almost all independent now and sovereign nations now. And it's really important that we have an idea of, like, why do people speak about emancipation, independence? People have coined terms like emancipendence, like blending them while they're two distinctly different things. But in the course of pulling together on what it took for people to be emancipated and what types of trials and tribulations and liberation struggles did they go through, what sacrifices were made for people to be emancipated from enslavement, and then bringing it forward because the living conditions didn't really change, whether it was in the former British colonies in the 1830s or in the former Danish colonies in the 1840s, or even with the Emancipation Proclamation in 48 contiguous US in the 1860s. These, just notice what's happened: 1830s, 1840s, 1860s. See, you can see the math that there, while we were navigating as people of African ancestry, as well as other indigenous people of color, I want to make sure of color, what people like to call BIPOC, but essentially people of African ancestry, whether they came through indigenous spaces, whether they came through Eurasian spaces, whether they came through the Native Amerindian spaces, right? There was a certain limitation based on the activities of colonizers, of entities that were able to use whether it was religious means, institutionalized means, different forms of education, and so forth to actually bring some very disheartening forms of inhumanity at a time while people were still able to thrive in certain spaces around this globe that we call the earth community. Yeah. So I offer these short pieces because sometimes we do not get an opportunity to really share with one another on, like, where do you live? When people talk about what's going on in the 48 contiguous US, we got to go like this sometimes. And then other people feel that everything is moving perfectly. They're very comfortable with some of the 18th century, 19th century divine providence perspectives that used to exist back in those times. Some persons are very comfortable with the 48 contiguous United States of America returning to what people think was great. And no one is going to get into that particular conversation because that becomes a distraction that takes us away from the course, the most healing course that we can possibly engage in, which is returning our mindset, our thought processes, our priorities on making sure that we can thrive irrespective of what chaos is going on in their world, because we've always done that. And that's the part that I'd like to kind of hone in on for tonight's broadcast are some of the ways in which this is being done. And specifically encouraging persons, you can read between the lines or listen carefully to what's being shared, or take a moment and do your own research, because it's not about believing what I'm saying. I'm encouraging listeners and viewers to know the truth and know what our blessed options are. Because even in the midst of chaos, there is order. Even in the midst of so much struggling and strife, there will be balance. And for some people, they refer to it as karma. For some people, they refer to it as restorative justice. And we have a number of names. That's one of the things that we're very good at. We can describe things 5,000 different ways using a host of vocabulary terms. But for the purposes of what we're discussing and sharing tonight, we have the ability to really hold strength. And prayer without action is useless. But prayer with sacred intention and action, how we live, how we speak with one another, the type of respect we share with one another, the way that we care for one another, that is an opportunity that only the greatest of the greatest have been able to secure and move through. So, again, I offer my most healing words when I speak of these different aspects of what is taking place in these spaces like the Virgin Islands of the US, what's happening in the wider Caribbean, what's happening throughout the Americas from the North Pole to the South Pole, what is the impact of things happening in Eurasia, of course, in our African continent, around Oceania, India, the entire globe is experiencing the things that we're experiencing. We're seeing flooding in places that do not customarily flood. So we have to send prayers and resources and support for families that have experienced so much loss. Yes, in the 48 contiguous US, but I hope persons are noticing this is happening globally, where there are flood situations that are unprecedented historically, earthquakes that are in places that usually may have a few tremors, but they're not beyond anything like a 4.5 and a 6.9. And in some instances, we're forgetting the impact that if the earth quakes, if the earth shakes, the earth tremors, then of course there's going to be impact in other parts of the world, whether it will be some type of a tsunami, whether it will be some type of a volcanic eruption. And while these things are happening, for those that do accept and know the science of the importance of what people refer to in the more environmental science around the blue economy, our marine life, our island life, those of us that live on islands, and we include Australia because as quiet as it's kept, Australia is not a continent, it's an island, just a very big one. And it's important for us to be aware of how this is affecting plant life, mineral life, animals, and of course, humans. And this is a time for us to return to Source, that reconnection with Infinite Source. If you already have the connection, amen, prayers to you. Do I interpret that? It's powerful. Some persons are so reor they're disoriented and they're working on getting some type of reorientation of how to reconnect and restore balance and order in their day-to-day life. Persons have been shifted by different natural disasters. Persons have been shifted by global pandemics. People have been shifted by serious transformations politically, economically, and beyond. And at the very core, when it looks like people can at least reach some degree of stability, there are these other, I call them demonic terrorists. Everybody's got a term, but I call them demonic terrorists. That they're like genocidas. They want to kill your spirit. They want to destroy your balance. They want to make you uncomfortable on how you eat, uncomfortable on how you can get health care, uncomfortable on where you live, uncomfortable on how you make your money. Make your money and keep your money so that it can continue to be cycled in our communities so that we can have the resources we need to live. And persons are doing this in a way that many times it creates conflict between those of us that it should not create conflict between or among. It's not just one, two. It's a whole system that's intentionally keeping us distracted from the core of things that allow us to thrive, not just survive, but to actually thrive and flourish and be prosperous. When I offer these types of things in conversations, uh, as an educator, as a healer, as a priestess, as a global cultural heritage ambassador, and as a communication scientist, right? Because how we say things, we always come back to these platforms and frameworks like Pulse, people using language skills effectively, and people learning how to use those frameworks to communicate, whether you're using the ghost, something like gentle, honest, open, specific talk. These are frameworks and techniques that have been used for decades now, through many of the original research and works of persons Dr. Nancy Love, coming out of Canada and working in concert with other professionals and going into spaces, including Africa, utilizing that Enneagram, that balance of the nine, as a framework of how do you deal with your inner self, your outer self, your higher self, your body self consciousness, and all the different elements that allow for you to reassess how you communicate, how you listen, how you learn, how you teach, how you engage in counsel, and how do you thrive. Like, what is the framework that helps you to thrive? And we're moving, some persons have it, or at least it appears that they have it in order, in fullness. And some persons may appear like they do not have it in fullness at all. How do we work together and move in a more cooperative healing form to be able to move some of these things that we speak of so eloquently in terms of moving the conversation forward? So I take a moment of reflection and pause because I know I've covered several different points in a short time. And I just would like for those that may have just joined us to just have some clarity on when we speak of I Speaks, we're always incorporating ancient sacred traditions in a form that can be integrated well in contemporary times, and speaking in the form where we are able to respectfully gather information, share information, show love and respect for one another, and bring certain areas of truth and power into our discourses, our studies, our life frames, our actionable deliverables, and more. We're going to take a slight moment of reflection for all the persons in our respective communities that have experienced loss, challenges in life, and encouraging just a moment of reflection. Take a deep breath and just hold that breath. And when you release that breath, we're asking for all of those things that are harsh to be released. And just breathe normally. Sometimes we do not take time to breathe and to offer moments of reflection and to give thanks for what we may have now, even if it's less than what we desire, and to give thanks for others in our immediate community, in our national community, in our regional communities, in our international communities, so that there can be some degree of lessening of the chaos, the imbalance, the demonic terrorism, the genocide. And we're commanding that because just invoke what it would look like if authentic global peace and tranquility were to be restored. The more we invoke that, the more we see that, the more we correct our mindsets to make that manifest, not just the distractions. Let us see and affirm and pray for what we desire, not against things, but for things, and for people, and for humanity, and for harmony, and for tranquility, and for prosperity, and wealth in abundance that is equitably distributed. What would it look like if hunger wasn't an issue? What would it be if, to the best of our global ability, wellness, healthcare, resources for wellness and healthcare were more equitably distributed to minimize health disparities, what would that look like? The more that we begin to speak what we'd like to see, the difference in the change for the greater good, especially for our human family and civilization, it would be remarkable. And I'm sure to some people, this is a very idealistic perspective to have. However, the more that we begin to see and invoke sacred with sacred intention what we'd like to see, the more that can come. And of course, while we're doing this, we're taking corrective action. We're doing our part, whether it's for you to do your agricultural gardening or support another local farmer, start having cooperatives in our respective communities, because people that don't have food don't move well. So agriculture becomes like one of our key engagements. If you don't know who's growing food in your community, take some time and find out and get to know that person. Help them occasionally. You may not be the farmer, but you might be able to help them with doing things on the farm, and there would be a organic exchange. You may not be the farmer, but you might be the chef. And if you're not the chef, you might be the person that knows how to do the canning and the bottling and the preservation of the foods. And if you're not either of those three, you might be the person that takes some of those skins from the fruits or vegetables that they grow to create some other kind of agribusiness. Just know that it's a cycle, it's a process that allows for everyone to participate. That's how we used to move. And that was at a time where the earth communities, our civilizations, move with much more ease. It might be that you are the person that grows the materials that allow us to produce, indigo and textiles for cloth and linen and so forth. Could be. It might be that you're the person that produces the various herbs for tea bags and that help to keep our people healed. Or materials that lead, rubber trees so that we have, whatever materials we need from rubber and so forth, or glue and things, or shampoo and so forth. Not everything has to come, and of course, I might be focusing on just the vegan side, but we know people need leather, people need goat, people need, chicken and lamb and stuff. I'm not sure about some of these other animals that people like to put in their system, but I'm just saying in terms of we have to look at agriculture, agribusiness, agritourism as something to help us to move through these distractions. We are also looking at ways in which we deal with architecture and construction, housing. No one should be tripping while they're struggling to make $50,000 a year and are expected to pay $5,000 a month to live somewhere with their family. And everyone cannot live in housing communities that are putting people so close that that too creates another form of tension. And there's enough land on this earth for everybody. Believe it or not, all 8 billion and counting could easily get some space for familial residence at least. We have some people that have houses in every country that they work in, which sometimes exceeds 10. We have persons that have a 40,000 square foot home, and it's a family of two with occasional visits from other relatives. And then we have persons living in less than 200 square feet. right next to row houses with limited shared water sources, limited septic systems. Some persons are still dealing with outhouses in 2025, not by choice, but just by design. So, as I said, we're talking about things that come with how we build community, how we build legacy. Some persons thought I was going to spend more time talking about the historiography because some of that I can just announce. But I just like us to have in our mindset agriculture, architecture, and construction, building, housing. When we talk about astronomy, it's important to know that there's going to be, whether it's an eclipse, a total eclipse, a partial eclipse, is it a solar one, a lunar one? Do we have meteorites flying around? Just keep in mind that when these things happen, it affects the human family. The entire civilization is impacted by these things. So don't, when we look up, when was the last time you looked up in the sky and just relaxed your mind and laid flat on your back and just looked up at the heavens? We speak about heaven a lot, but do you really look in the night at the abundance of stars? And if you can't see them, then this is my other suggestion. If you can't see them, there is this wonderful app called Skyview. You can get it on your phone. You can get a free version, but if you like all of the whistles and bells to be able to take pictures of what you find, and don't get twisted on the Greek references to Pegasus and all of that. Look at the scientific names of the stars. You'll see where planets are, and not to do an astrological, that's the human interpretation part, but just recognize that if you have a planet coming closer to the earth, it's going to change the environmental flow. We might get more rain in areas that are usually dry. We might have more storms in areas that usually do not have them. The water might rise because there is a relationship, let's say, for example, between Uranus, one of the planets in our solar system, and the Earth. And if it comes very close, it's going to change things. Just like when we speak of Mars, it's the fire planet. When it gets too close, it gets very hot. It's a fire planet. Fire, blue Earth, hot. These are astronomy is a great science, and I always encourage persons to look into persons like Dr. Tyson, one of the best physicists, one of the most knowledgeable scientists that we have still amongst the living with us. And again, looking at his work and doing things comparatively. But for those that want to go the app route to just get an idea of what's around you and what is above you, especially when the sun goes down and you can actually see the stars. But even if it's cloudy, what I appreciate about this app is this going straight from satellite to satellite to give you a vision of what's in the sky and how it, and then you can do your own research on how it impacts us. Again, not the astrology part. That's another science that I leave for the persons that are more proficient in that arena. We're just speaking of the astronomical science. So let's go back. Agriculture, architecture, construction, because they go together, astronomy, and the arts that govern the entire universe. So whether it's healing arts, visual arts, scientific arts, because people forget that there's a science in the arts, right? Some people specify performing arts, creative arts. There's so many different elements because art is takes up a whole dimension in our brain. You got your arts brain, your science brain, and they work together. So we're speaking of those things that primarily start with the letter A, and we went from the architecture, so agriculture, architecture and construction, astronomy, and the arts. And if we look at things through that lens, of course, there's many other areas to include that because when I speak of the healing arts, I'm speaking of the healing arts and sciences. When I speak of agriculture, agriculture also includes wellness. All of these conversations become mute and useless if we're not well enough to thrive. If our body frames are not taken care of, we're using what's the really popular phrase now? Self care. Self care. Our healing is so important. Our wellness is equitably important. And to the best of our abilities, this is a grand time in the midst of all of these global distractions for us to come together in harmony and unity, principled, of course, respectful, of course. And again, we're not going to all agree on everything. And we're probably not going to agree on many things, just in terms of how it's done, because there's 8 billion people. So there's 8 billion thoughts to things. And that's a lot. And I say that this is an opportune time for us to reassess, reactivate how we bring truth as power. Now that I've covered those things for most of tonight's broadcast, I'm going to share a few announcements. As I mentioned earlier, the month of July, in many respects, amongst the Rastafari community internationally, is acknowledged to highlight the day of birth, July 23rd, of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia. And for persons that aren't aware, what was really powerful is that this is like global. So there's activities happening in Ethiopia, there's activities happening all around the globe amongst the Rastafari. And I want to be very specific. I didn't say Rastafarian, because that's a little different. That's more of a religiosity piece. I speak of the Rastafari civilization, the Rastafari liberty that is grounded in very principled, very disciplined forms of order. And I feel it was really important that even in a small community like the Virgin Islands, that the executive branch of government, actually on June 16th, which is another significant day in the history of humanity, because when we speak of June 16th, it's a very commemorative day to many. It referred, for those that may not be familiar, in South Africa, June 16th, 1976, as the 48 contiguous United States was in the heyday of bicentennial celebrations. In Soweto, South Africa, there was a widespread socio-political uprising, and many youth, particularly there was uprising by African students, lost their lives. It was a wave of anti-apartheid activities, and many, named and unnamed, lost their lives on that day, June 16th, 1976. And the uprisings lasted for several other days. So I don't wish to spend as much time on that, but I want to highlight that on that particular day, what was happening in the world in 1976. Moment of reflection and prayer with action, because we recognize that it took up until 1994 for there to actually be a relaxation, if you will, of the apartheid, or the down press of the apartheid system in South Africa, with the release and ultimate presidency led by Nelson Mandela, alongside the support of his wife, Winnie Mandela. So I just want people to get the context on why June 16th is another one of those days that you go, wow. So June 16th, 2025, in the Virgin Islands, the executive branch of government designated July 23rd, or I should be more specific, yeah, July 23rd as Virgin Islands Rastafari Day. And that may not seem like a really big issue to some, but it's a very big issue considering the types of trials and tribulations, the forms of discrimination, the attacks, the head, the hair cutting, the forcible hair cutting, the imprisonment, the torture, and even the death of many practitioners, many Rastafari leaders and followers throughout the region and throughout the world, even. There was a time where persons who even tied their head, even if they thought you had locks, you would not be allowed entry into certain countries. And that used to happen right here in the Virgin Islands. Or you would be in prison because you looked like you were into Rastafari. It even beyond the cannabis as a sacramental piece. I just want to highlight that. So we really wanted to send some congratulations to our Rastafari community in the Virgin Islands, through the House of Nyabingi, Ethiopian World Federation, and all the Rastafari houses. They gathered to professionally, respectfully, and principally negotiate, craft not only the proclamation for July 23rd, which is the Earth Strong of His Imperial Majesty Emperor Haile Selassie the First, as Virgin Islands Rastafari Day, but this is something that's spreading around the globe to recognize the role of Rastafari. And I would be remiss if I didn't speak of even the opportunities. I speak of Ras Tazadi Tafari in St. Croix, Virgin Islands, who was really instrumental of working and negotiating cooperative collective engagement amongst the various Rastafari houses to respectfully and most honorably have this organized, and also to have an apology given from the executive branch of government regarding the forms of discrimination and the trials and tribulations that many people of the Rastafari community had endured for decades. So this would like to highlight that part. Another piece, as I mentioned earlier, is that there's a lot going on in the Virgin Islands in the to develop and establish a successful, I'm going to say that again, to establish and develop a successful creation of a constitution for the Virgin Islands of the United States. And although many people will hear U.S. Virgin Islands, United States Virgin Islands, the legal name from the transfer time, from the establishment of a organic act, served as a governing body of laws and policies for the Virgin Islands, and in accordance to even the revised Organic Act of 1954, according to the secession treaty, separating the Virgin Islands, excuse me, the Danish West Indies, what it was formerly, to becoming the Virgin Islands of the United States. The legal name is Virgin Islands of the United States, not United States Virgin Islands. So it's more like Virgin Islands US. And some people shifted to Virgin Islands Us, which just shifts that colonial mentality that some people now refer to similarly through the works of scholars and United Nations presidential advisors like Dr. Carlisle Corbin the phrase colonialocracy. So it's like a colonialism covered with a democracy that is blended. Because in 1916, going into 1917, the intention was this was the Virgin Islands of the United States. And even as the League of Nations was formed in 1948, moving forward into even the United Nations, because that shifted in the between the 50s and the 60s, that you had United Nations still has resolutions from back in the 50s and 60s saying that there should be no more colonies on the earth. So there's some that's a whole other conversation. We'll come back to that in one of our next broadcasts. We're looking forward to joining you next Sunday on August 3rd, which also happens to be the Honorable Father of Pan Africanism's birthday, the Reverend Dr. Edward Wilmot Blyther. And we'll get a chance to speak more about those types of things. Same time, same place, same station. I would also like to highlight that there are going to be a number of activities around relations that the U.S. has with the wider Caribbean nation states. So whether it's Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Antigua and Barbuda, Bahamas, St. Vincent and the Grenadines Islands, inclusive of places that are connected to the Caribbean Sea like Belize, Honduras, Panama, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, of course, Jamaica. I don't want to leave anyone out, right? I think it's St. Kitts Nevis, Antigua Barbuda, St. Lucia, Guadeloupe, St. Martin. And when I say St. Martin, I'm speaking of the whole island, Swaliga. So we'll let the Dutch French piece come a little later, but we're speaking of the entire space. Curacao, Aruba, Bonaire, which has a serious quest on their Bonaire Human Rights Organization, which is really, they spend so much time in the United Nations on their quest of decolonization, self determination, and the authentic voices of those spaces. And I'm sharing this because sometimes we've overlooked that we're looking at the 48 contiguous US. And if we look at our neighborhoods, everybody has ties to the rest of the world. Everybody, everybody. The minute we go beyond grandparents, we're usually, and if you're fortunate, if you've got 9, 10 generations solely in 48 contiguous, that's great too. Just recognize that we are a global people living in very engaging spaces. And if we allow the distractors to keep us divided, then they win. And it's nothing wrong with vibrating on what people refer to as local. I like to use the term homegrown because homegrown has a more authentic grounding. Because local could be somebody that moved into your neighborhood, and in some places, in 90 days, they're considered local. In some states, it might take a year, but they'll be considered local. When you're homegrown, you have a multi generational tie through work, through spiritual energy, through emotional engagement, through the labor and sweat of your brow. It's a little different. And I'd like for us to move in that accord when we start to speak about these things. The My closing comment, because we've come to the top of our hour almost, and I really would like to give a special shout out. I wasn't looking on that part of the screen. So giving thanks for you joining and sharing your greetings. Latonia, Little John, grateful. I would be remiss if I didn't highlight that there are so many wonderful. There's been the day of national significance. Just listen to how that commemorative vibe is in Barbados on July 26th annually, where they honor and highlight many of their sheroes and heroes that were contributory to the upliftment of the one of the newest republics, the newest republic in the Caribbean, the Republic of Barbados, currently under the leadership of Her Excellency Prime Minister Mia Amor Mottley. And their whole energetics around sharing history, culture, traditions through the arts and the sciences, using technology and various forms of creativity to share the legacy, the more accurate, well researched narratives of what took place in this space of Barbados, particular to trade union activities in the 1930s and who were instrumental to those things. So whether there's a highlight, there's a wonderful Golden Square Park that they have revitalized as a sacred ground to highlight some of those freedom fighters, like Clement Payne, like Israel Daniel Lavelle, who happened to be the first president of the Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1914 in Barbados. I'd say these things because that's just one example. There was the reference of the July 26th observances in Cuba. And with that being said, there's going to be a number of different activities. Persons, feel free to email us at ospeaks ospeaks at gmail.com. Again, ospeaks at gmail.com. If you can at least, if we can at least have these exchanges, if you have other questions, am open to sharing more detail. But again, it's always a joy and a privilege to remember that a people without the knowledge of their past history, origin, and culture is like a tree without roots. That's a quote from the Honorable Marcus Messiah Garden, founding of the Universal Negro Improvement Association African Communities League, alongside many other great ones. I feel that we are at the closure of our piece. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in, joining in. I wish that you had posted some questions inside of the chat as well as on the YouTube page for the Crew podcast. We'll make sure that we have that information available for listeners and viewers in the near future. Again, this has been Queen Mother Dr. Chansira of Us Speaks, Building a New Legacy with the Crew Podcast and Media Network. And we look forward to you joining us every evening. I always tell persons 8 p.m. Eastern. You can always see the details on the Crew Podcast, Queens of Collaboration. There's a lot of opportunities inside of Facebook and other platforms, YouTube, etc., Instagram, to be able to know, because there's a powerhouse of, of broadcasters that are always bringing information that facilitate each of us moving through prosperously and building legacy in all the ways possible that we can. Remember that culture heals humanity, land is our foundation, and spiritual harmony unifies us. And I encourage everyone to keep doing your part to build a new legacy. Until the next time, be balanced, harmonious, and do your best. What's up? Peace.